Our Bible word is Matthew 13, verses 24 to 26. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So let's have a look at the context of the Gospel of Matthew. And the issue the Gospel addresses is, who are the people of God? Even today, many people pose that question in terms of who are the true people of God. And the Gospel of Matthew, within its Jewish context, would have answered it, we, those, in other words, the followers of Christ, we are the true people of God. And the general things that the Gospel addresses can be summarized under the following three items. Number one is that God has reconstituted His covenant people. In other words, the covenant has been renewed. There's a new covenant people that has been established. Secondly, it's what's the correct way to interpret the law and the prophets. As we shall see later also, for this community for whom the gospel was written, Jesus was the new Moses. He was a true interpreter of the law. And thirdly, it also explains how Jesus was the agent, in other words, this Messiah who established the kingdom of God on the earth. And so the author of the gospel, he wants to say this is where true Judaism is to be found. It's those who follow Jesus. This was the fulfillment of God's purposes for Israel. That's to be found here. We are the authentic, true people of God. And he uses generally those three areas to explain this, how some things have changed. So we have to do here with an internal Jewish dialogue. It's between one group of Jews arguing against another group of Jews. Because this is now, the Gospel of Matthew is dated to somewhere between the 80s or 90 AD, more or less. And this was after the temple was destroyed. And of course, the Jewish world was in tatters because the temple has been destroyed. There's no more sacrifices, especially sacrifices of atonement. How do we live? How do we relate to God without the temple? Because God was especially present in the temple. So many Jews came together at Yamnia. These were priests, Pharisees, etc. And they came together and they said, we're now going to formulate this is Judaism. In view of what has happened after the destruction of the temple, this is the boundaries of true Judaism. And of course they were in conflict with Christians, Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus, who also said, no, we are true Judaism. This is where it will be found. And it was also here at Yamnia. This is where the incipient, or the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism started. They came together and of course they said, well, this is how we must live as Jews from now on. And also in their conflict with Christians, they added a special clause to a prayer. And it's also known as the Birchat Haminim. And benediction number 12 was probably added at Yamnia at this time. This is towards the end of the first century, around 85 AD, where now this benediction 12 read as follows: and for apostates let there be no hope. Of course, this is referring to Christians. It's referring to Sadducees, also reject the resurrection, etc. And may the insolent kingdom be quickly uprooted in our days. And may the Nazarenes, that's the followers of Jesus, and the heretics perish quickly, and may they be erased from the book of life. So we see here an internal debate, this internal conflict. It's one Jewish group under the rabbis or the incipient rabbinic movement. There's another group for these Jewish Christians. Now there's this argument, who are the true people of God? If we look at the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, of course, according to early church tradition, it was written by Matthew, the disciple of Jesus. And Eusebius also, he writes there that the disciple Matthew collected the sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted or translated them as he was able. Now it may well be that this Matthew wrote or collected sayings of Jesus. But most scholars today, they don't see this gospel as written by a Matthew the tax collector. This gospel was written by a scribe. He was written by a scholar of Jewish law. He was a very learned person. And because he quotes from the Septuagint, that in other words the Greek translation of the Old Testament, he also in other places quotes directly from the Hebrew, that he translates himself from Hebrew into Greek. And this author is also very interested in exactly the same issues as that the Pharisees and the scribes were interested in. The law, and how to interpret the law, how to apply the law in everyday life. And scholars also see, if you go read Matthew 13 verses 52, as a where the author, the evangelist who wrote this gospel, he makes a reference also to himself in a way, because it says there, therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. So scholars see, we see the author here. He's a scribe. He's instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. He takes from the treasure things old and new, etc. So the author, a scribe, a learned person, very interested in the law and how to interpret the law. And as I said, it's dated to the 80s or 90s AD, and it appears that the audience who this gospel was written for found themselves in an urban environment. And because quite often the evangelists where the Gospel of Mark as village, our author will replace village with city. And most scholars would suggest that the place where this was written was Antioch in Syria. Of course, where there was a very big and Christian community already established from the earliest times. So our author is also writing in the main for a Jewish audience, because this gospel has a very strong Jewish orientation. And our author, he emphasizes what's in continuity with the Old Covenant, but also what's new. So there's both discontinuities and continuities with the Old Covenant. In other words, the message of the New Testament. And also important for this community is Jesus is the new Moses. He is the new lawgiver. If you were a Jew in the first century, the law would have still remained a very important aspect of your identity. Because the law came from your ancestors. It was given through Moses. But now Jesus the Messiah has come. And he's the new Moses. He's the new lawgiver. And he's the one who gives the true interpretation of the law. So our evangelist, he sets out in the gospel an alternative way of being Jewish. In other words, where the true people of God are to be found, in conflict with other Jews who have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And we also see this tension because our author, he speaks of these other Jewish groups. And he refers to their synagogues. Right? Not our synagogues, their synagogues, where these other Jews come together who do not believe in Jesus. And he also makes mention of their scribes. So these other Jews who probably formed around this rabbinic movement that's growing, they have their synagogues and their scribes. And there's a Christian community, the Christian Jews over here, who also have their own synagogues, now their own congregations, and also their own scribes. So again, there's this conflict going on between the two communities. Also, the way the author explains Jesus being this new Moses. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, On 6 occasions, Jesus contrasts old teaching with his own teaching. On 6 occasions, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." And then he says, "But I say to you." And so Jesus, he's the new Moses. So that this contrast also makes this clear. And also in Deuteronomy, if we go to Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 to 18, we read there, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me," in other words, like Moses, "from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear." And that fulfillment of that we find in Matthew 17, verses 5. That is where Jesus is transfigured on the mount. "While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud, saying, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him.'" So we can see the instruction from Deuteronomy is been fulfilled or was encouraged in Matthew. Hear Jesus. He is this prophet like Moses that has been promised. And lastly, we can also mention the structure of Matthew. The structure of Matthew is built around 5 major discourses of Jesus. And every discourse of Jesus ends in the following manner, something like this. "And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings." And we find it there in end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 11, etc., as you can see there on screen. And these indicate this is the end of a big discourse. And there are 5 of them. And they imitate the 5 books of Moses. In other words, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, etc. The first 5 books of Moses. And it's another way of saying, we have Jesus, the new Moses is among us. In addition to being the Son of God, the Messiah, a prophet, etc., he is the new Moses. He is the authentic. He is the true interpreter of the law. Not with the Pharisees, those rabbis there and their scribes. The true interpretation of God's will we find in this community, the community of Jesus and his followers. And of course his 5 discourses, they are the Sermon on the Mount, that's the commissioning of the 12, that's where the 12 are sent out. There's the parables of the kingdom, that's the rules for church life and discipline. And there's also the Olivet discourse, where Jesus speaks of the future. So there are various ways our author writes about Jesus being this new Moses. Also, lastly, we can mention, in terms of the continuity between Jesus and the Old Covenant, our author often makes use of fulfillment formulas and Old Testament quotations. For example, often we find it on 10 occasions, we find the author writes that it might be fulfilled. For example, if we look at the virgin birth of Jesus, it says in chapter 1 verses 22, "So all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord to the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child," etc. So on 10 occasions it makes use of this fulfillment formula, that it might be fulfilled. And also on 12 other occasions, the evangelist just puts in a quotation from the Old Testament, where Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. For example, his birth in Bethlehem. There, our evangelist refers to Micah 5 verses 2. So, for the author, Jesus is the new Moses. This is the new covenant people. Jesus is God's agent. He's the Messiah. Jesus as the new Moses is the true interpreter of the law. He's a fulfillment of Israel's hopes. He's a fulfillment of prophecies and what the prophets had to say in the Old Testament. So this was a Jewish community, and they were struggling. They were being marginalized. They were being kicked out of the synagogues by their fellow Judeans because of their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Our focus now is on chapter 13. That's the parables of the kingdom. That's one of Jesus' great discourses. Again, Jesus, the new Moses, is speaking. And there are three major units in chapter 13. The first one is where it begins and ends with a parable of the sower. The second one begins and ends with a parable of the tares. And the third begins and ends with imagery of treasure. So here's Jesus. He's again like he went onto a boat and again he's seated. Remember the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus also there is seated. He's the teacher. He's the new Moses speaking now. And here he's speaking in parables. And it says here, large crowds gathered to Jesus. But we also see here in chapter 13, eventually the narrative focuses or moves away from the crowds to the disciples. Because eventually it's only the disciples of Jesus who will hear his parables and who will accept and understand his parables. So there are these three cycles of parables. It moves from the crowds and then it narrows on to the disciples. And Jesus also explains to them what the parables mean. It is explained why Jesus speaks in parables, and also it's the mystery of the kingdom of heaven, etc., that's given to these followers of Jesus. So our focus is the second unit. That is where it begins and it ends with the parable of the tares. And our immediate textual unit is there, chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. That's where Jesus specifically gives the parable. The interpretation of it is given later in verses 36 to 43. And the parable here is essentially about good people and bad people, or evil people. God sows good people. They are the good seed. And the devil sows bad people, the bad seed. So let's go read there from verses 24. And we come to our Bible word. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the scenario Jesus is painting here is, of course, the sowing of seed. I mean, agriculture was a basic way of life in the world of Jesus there in Galilee. And it's good seed that the farmer sows. And at night, everybody is asleep. His enemy is probably a neighbor, a jealous neighbor, an envious neighbor who came and sowed bad seed that resembles evil people, as we will see. And the picture here is that as these plants grow up, the wheat and the tares, you cannot actually distinguish them so clearly. They look very similar. And the Greek word for the tares is actually zizania. But we don't know what this zizania is, but it's a plant that looked very similar to the wheat plants. The only time that you can really tell the difference between the two of them is when they start producing fruit. In other words, the wheat itself, or the grain. That is where you can clearly identify this is the zizania, or the tares, or this is the wheat, the real plants or crop that was supposed to grow up here. Of course, the imagery is here also as that there are those who are amongst God's people who look very similar, but they don't actually belong to God's people because they have been sown by the devil. But you will know them by their fruits, as Jesus also says in another place. And God's true people will also be recognized by their fruits. They might look similar, but you can tell them apart by the fruits that they will eventually bear. Now if we go on in verses 27. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? So in other words, what about the quality control of the seed? Didn't you check the seed you sowed? What about your supplier? Is he trustworthy? I mean, did he put bad seed amongst the good seed? And then they also suggest, mustn't we gather the tares now, get rid of it, and solve the problem? And then the landowner, he tells his slaves. Of course, we also learn here that the farmer here is not a subsistence farmer. He was actually a wealthy landowner. He had slaves who worked in his fields. Then Jesus also says, look, an enemy has done this. Because they also ask, who could do this? An enemy, in other words, an envious neighbor. But of course, within the parable, it means it's the devil who has sowed this bad seed. In other words, the evil people. So do you want us to gather this zizania or these tares up? And then the owner of the land says them, no, lest while you gather up the tares, you will also uproot the wheat with them. So the owner says, let things run its course. Let both grow up to full maturity. Let's give the true wheat the opportunity for their fruit to mature. There's already evidence who's the evil people and the good people. Those who truly belong to God and those who don't. But those who belong to God, give them the opportunity so that their fruit can mature. It can fully ripen. At the time of the harvest, we'll take care of this, Jesus says. So let's read from verse 30. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So, they are the true people of God, and with the true people of God are those who appear to be the people of God, but they are not. It's their fruits that distinguish them. And here it says, let them both grow together. The time of harvest will come, and then we will take care of this wheat. The tares. We'll get rid of the tares, and it will be burned up. And then the field will show the true purpose of the sowing. It's where the wheat will appear with ripened fruit. In other words, the righteous, those who belong to God's people, they are the ones that will remain.